So we do know that Jesus did have secret teachings, and we do know that Paul had secret teachings. And the interesting thing is that it seems that those secret teachings were the same thing. They correspond exactly with the kinds of things that Buddha was saying, that other mystics have been saying.
Why do you think that the religion of Christianity has tried so hard to suppress divergent ideas about who Jesus was, even when documents come to the surface that are telling a different story? I am back today with Keith Giles, who is a returning guest for the fourth time. And this is actually the first time I've ever had anyone on that many times. So thank you for joining me, Keith.
Well, Melissa, I'm honored. Thank you. Thank you for letting me be the first and only person to come on 4 times.
Of course. And it feels right to me because I think that you were actually my first interview. You interviewed me. Yeah.
Oh,
so
okay. Wow.
So it's meant to be.
Yeah.
So we are here today to talk about the Gospel of Thomas, and Keith has written an absolutely amazing, my favorite book ever written on the Gospel of Thomas, actually, where he goes through and breaks down every single one of the sayings in the book through a non-dual lens. And so I'm just going to give a little bit of background on why this topic is so interesting to me. Because as most people watching will know, I was raised in a strict branch of Christianity. And although I don't consider myself a Christian anymore, and I could say that probably the vast majority of my viewers are not Christian, but are still very interested in the story of Jesus, consider Jesus a historical person, and believe that he played some kind of important role for humanity. And I'm personally very interested in any historical evidence that we have of what Jesus actually taught, what he actually stood for, what his message actually was. And the Gospel of Thomas is one of the historical books that has been the most fascinating to me, simply because there is historical evidence for its accuracy, and it sheds a completely different light on the message of Jesus of Nazareth. So, Keith, with that introduction, let's hear a little bit about your journey with the Gospel of Thomas, and how did you come across it, and how did you come to believe that it was a reliable source of information?
Oh, great questions. Yeah, so like you, I was raised evangelical. I was raised in the Southern Baptist Church and licensed and ordained as a Southern Baptist preacher and all that. I also have gone through my deconstruction process, and now I don't really consider myself a Christian per se. I guess that's post-Christian now. Although I still love Jesus. I've never lost my fascination with Jesus and my interest in Jesus, especially as you said, an historic person who had spiritual insight and wisdom, and I believe had insight into things that are still important for us today spiritually, for the sort of spiritual growth and transformation and evolution of humanity. But back when I was still an evangelical Christian and really just beginning my deconstruction process, someone recommended that I read the Gospel of Thomas. And I'll just admit, the first time I read it, I thought it was the dumbest thing I'd ever read. I read it, and because some of the sayings are so cryptic and so almost it seems like they're intentionally confusing. I was just like, Jesus didn't say this stuff. This is just too weird. And I just dismissed it. I probably didn't even make it all halfway through it, and I just put it away. And that was kind of my opinion of the Gospel of Thomas for probably like 5 or 6 years. But a few years ago, maybe, I guess really only like maybe 3, 4 years ago, someone mailed me a book on the Gospel of Thomas by a guy named William Duffy. And it's called The Hidden Gospel of Thomas. And they said, you should read this book. So I was getting ready to take a trip. I was going to fly somewhere. I just grabbed the book. I think it came the same day or the day before. I just shoved it in my bag on my carry-on. Now I'm on the plane. I'm bored. I pull out this book. I start reading the introduction. And well, the first things that Duffy says in the book in the introduction is that many people, when they read the Gospel of Thomas, can't understand it. The sayings don't make any sense. And I'm like, yep, you're right. That's me. Okay, I'm with you so far. This makes no sense. And then he says, well, it's because we tend to not read it through the correct lens. But if we understand the right way to read it, the right lens to approach the Gospel of Thomas, the sayings actually make complete sense. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'm intrigued. So what is this lens? And he says, well, we have to read them all through this lens of non-duality, of, our divine, our shared divinity and our shared humanity, that everything Jesus is trying to communicate through the Gospel of Thomas and the sayings have something to do either with non-duality or shared divinity or something like that. So I'm like, okay, well, maybe. I'm still not convinced, right? But maybe that's right. And he gave a couple of examples. I'm like, okay, yeah, I can see that. But then I thought, but that it felt arbitrary to me at the time. I just kind of felt like he just sort of figured out a way to like make sense of it. Like, oh, if you read it this way, it makes sense. Like, well, maybe, but maybe not. I mean, how do we know that that's really the correct lens to read it through, right? So I'm still skeptical. But I keep reading the book. And then I come to a place in the book where he basically proves it. And he proves it using one of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas. It's saying number 7. I don't know if you want me to go into all the details of this, but basically,
Sure.
he used it, and so essentially what it is, I'll just read it real quick. Here's saying 7. This is probably the point when I was reading it the first time that I just put it aside and said, this is nonsense, right? And here it is. Here it is. Saying number 7. Again, if you don't understand how to read it, it's going to sound really strange. Here it says, Jesus said, "Blessed is the lion that becomes man when consumed by man, and cursed is the man whom the lion consumes, and the man becomes a lion." I'm like, yep, that's dumb. I don't get that. That makes no sense. But anyway, Duffy in his book uses that saying, and he says, again, read this through this lens. Again, Jesus is using metaphor, which, by the way, even in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he does this, right? Everything he does, everything, the parables, it's not just a guy, a shepherd. It's not just a sheep. It's not just a son or a woman losing a coin. Like, all of these mean something, right? There's a deeper meaning than what's on the surface. So he says, like with everything Jesus does, the lion stands for something and the man stands for something. And he says the lion stands for your ego. And the ego is the part of you that is very us and them focused, right? I'm the lion, you're an opponent, or you're the prey. I'm against you. It's us and them kind of antagonism, and I have to overcome you. I have to overpower you. I can't submit to you and all that. So that's the lion that's what that means. And the man is talking about the self, the true self within. And this is the part of us that recognizes our divinity, our connection with God, and recognizes our shared humanity with everyone else. And so when you read it through that filter, right? Blessed is the ego. Actually, I think I have in the book here, I reworded here. I say, blessed is the ego that becomes the true self in Christ when consumed by the Christ, and cursed is the true self whom the false ego consumes. Now, there you go. It makes sense, right? So again, I'm like, okay, that's good. I'm feeling a little closer to, okay, maybe. But again, I'm asking these questions. How do I know that that's the right way to do it? And so here's where he dropped the bomb, and I was totally all in on this idea. He points out that when the Gospel of Thomas was discovered, again, because it was lost, and we can talk about this historically, right? It was lost to us from about 340, 350 AD until 1945 when it was discovered, right? So it was literally like buried in a time capsule in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, and was, for over 1,000 years. So when it was discovered, it was bundled with a whole bunch of other writings and scrolls, right? And the bundle that Thomas was in was also bundled with a fragment of Plato's Republic. And by the way, I think Plato's Republic is the only sort of non-religious text that was in with all the other discoveries, the writings discovered at Nag Hammadi along with Thomas. So why is this in there? Why is this fragment? It's only a couple of pages of Plato's Republic, and it's in the same bundle next to the Gospel of Thomas. It's bundled with the Gospel of Thomas. So guess which section of Plato's Republic are on those pages? It's a section of Plato's Republic where Plato uses the metaphor of a lion to talk about the ego and the man to talk about the true self. And I'm like, dude, he's absolutely right. So it's as if somebody took that fragment from Plato's Republic, which explains saying 7, made sure to put it next to Thomas. It's almost like saying, here's the key, right? here's how to understand it. Just in case you don't get it, if you read this, you'll understand it. So that was it for me. I realized he's right. This is the correct way to understand the Gospel of Thomas. And then every saying I read after that, and I continued to read it through that same lens of oneness and connection, I'm like, this makes absolute sense. And I just couldn't wait. I just kept reading more and more and more, because the more I read, the more I understood. And the more it was like saying something to me that was really profound. And it was really the right timing as well, because this was around the time that I had finished writing this 7-part book series on deconstruction. Personally, I was in a place of saying, okay, now what? And I was moving into the idea of embracing mystery. I wrote this book called Sola Mysterium, Embracing the Beautiful Uncertainty of Everything. And I was becoming more open to other texts outside of Scripture, like Black Elk and Rumi and, other mystics. And so when I discovered Thomas and I began to understand what Jesus was saying, it was perfect. It would just make complete sense to me. And it was really like this missing piece dropped into place. And that's what got me excited about Thomas.
Thank you for sharing your journey. I did not know that about Plato's Republic, but I do have to say I relate so much, because when you are in a Christian environment, there are hundreds, or if not thousands, of different diverging branches of Christianity, and
Yeah.
everybody is arguing as to why their branch is the correct interpretation. So here you are, just another perspective on how to interpret the teachings of Jesus. And so, of course, you would take some convincing to get there.
Yes.
And what we don't often understand from within a Christian perspective is that outside of that fundamentalist religion, all the mystical traditions, since the dawn of time, do not have that arguing amongst themselves.
Right.
Like, they are giving the same message, and it's a
That's right.
non-dual message about oneness and the divinity of everything. So it just makes so much sense that
Yep.
that's what Jesus would have been teaching. But I'm going to throw that back to you. How did this discovery change your view of Jesus?
Yeah. Well, it really did make me realize that this is sort of the main thing that Jesus was talking about. And again, this isn't as if the Gospel of Thomas isn't the only place we find Jesus talking like this. Again, my skeptical side would be like, well, that's really strange. Why didn't he mention these kinds of things in the other Gospels, right? Well, he does. And especially like say in the Gospel of John, where you have Jesus saying some things like, in fact, it's one of my favorite ones in the Gospel of John, I think it's John 14. Jesus tells his disciples, this is near the end of the Gospel. He tells his disciples, in that day, you will realize something. Meaning, you don't get this now. You don't understand what I'm about to say. But one day you're going to get it, right? One day you're going to have this realization. And so here it is. Here's what he says. One day you're going to realize something. Here it is. You're going to realize I am in the Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. And that's exactly the same thing he's saying in the Gospel of Thomas. He's saying that you and I are in the Father, we're in God, and we're also in one another. And that realization is going to be the thing that sort of like clicks and wakes us up. So, and by the way, the Apostle Paul, in the real writings of Paul, says much of the same things. And so being able to connect those dots, I guess as someone who has studied the Bible for a very long time, when I started seeing these things in Thomas, I started connecting the dots to like, Jesus would say something in one of the sayings, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is what Paul says in Galatians. And I read something else, like, oh, this is what Paul says in John. Or this is what Paul says in Mark. And so it really just made the teachings of Jesus open up for me and made me realize, it made me especially less skeptical of, as you were saying, sort of the legitimacy of the Gospel of Thomas. Because again, growing up as a Christian, you're told don't read those books. Those are apocryphal books, or they're Gnostic texts, and they're not legitimate. But when I started studying Thomas, not just the content, but sort of the history of Thomas, the more I realized, and there were many scholars and historians who have studied the text, who would argue that the Gospel of Thomas we would date it somewhere between the writing of the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John, which means was around at the same time, right? The other Gospels were being written. One of the reasons why is that we think this is that the Gospel of John, which was the latest one to be written, seems to have been written in response to some things that are in Thomas. And so the author of John would have to have read Thomas to respond to it. The other thing about it that's really interesting is that, again, lends credence to the evidence that Thomas is legitimately what it says to be, which is a collection of the sayings of Jesus. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But there was something that was theoretical. Sorry to get too deep here, but hopefully this
No,
isn't
go for it.
too inside baseball. So before we discovered the Gospel of Thomas, biblical scholars assumed that there must have been something called the Q document. And that's because the Gospels of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew were written at roughly the same time frame by two different people, and they disagree on a lot of the details of the life of Jesus. Like, did he go here? Did he go there? Did he go to Jerusalem first, or did he go do that first? Did he turn over the tables in the temple here? Or did he do it over this other time? And so they don't agree on a whole lot of the specifics of the life of Jesus. But the one place that Matthew and Luke agree absolutely verbatim is when they quote Jesus. So what's going on? Why is it that they disagree so much about the details of the life, the chronology of the life of Jesus, but they agree absolutely on when they quote Jesus? Well, so the theory was that there must have been a collection of the quotes of Jesus that they were both referring to, that someone had put this together. Someone had taken just a collection of the sayings of Jesus and written it down, and that was available, and Luke had a copy and Matthew had a copy. And when they're each telling their different versions of the story, when they quote Jesus, they're quoting him the same. Now, that was a theory. We've never discovered this Q document until 1945, when we unearthed this Nag Hammadi, time capsule collection of all these writings, which included Thomas. And when we started translating the Gospel of Thomas, what we realized is that the Gospel of Thomas is a Q document. It's not the Q document, we don't think, but it is a type of a Q document, meaning the Gospel of Thomas is just a collection of the sayings of Jesus. Jesus said, saying 1, saying 2, saying 3. There's 114 of these sayings. Half of them appear in the Gospels we already have in the Bible, the New Testament. The other half are brand new. So those details, again, are the reasons why a lot of scholars say this existed around that same time, between the writing of Mark and the writing of John. It's a collection of the sayings of Jesus that proves those types of things did exist at the time. And I think the other thing, just for me personally, that made me doubt this theory that Thomas was written later by a sort of a rival group of Christians who were trying to undermine the true gospel, because that's kind of what I've heard a lot as well, is that it doesn't make any sense. Like, if I'm going to write a counter narrative to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and tell a different story about Jesus, I would do that. I would tell a story. But the Gospel of Thomas is not a story. There are no details about the birth of Jesus, the life of Jesus, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the second coming, any of that. It's just Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said. Half of them are from the Gospels that we have. So again, it's like if your goal was to undermine Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, why is half of it from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the other half of it just other sayings? Like, it doesn't make sense. Like, that can't be what this is all about. So yeah, for me, the more I looked into the background of Thomas, I did a lot of reading of other scholars and what their opinion was of Thomas. Yeah, I became more convinced that this, I believe it really is what it says it is, that the disciples of Jesus wrote down the teachings that he gave them privately. And this is sort of the other part of it, that Jesus had one set of teachings that he gave the crowds when he spoke in parables, which he didn't explain. So they're kind of cryptic. And then there were teachings that he gave his disciples that were sort of private sayings that they were privy to these sayings. And that's consistent with what every rabbi did in the first century. That's consistent even with what Paul did. Paul says that he also has, this teachings of the mystery, but he can't, I get the letter, I think, to the Corinthians. He says, I wish that I could tell you these things, but you're not ready for it yet. You're still on the milk. You're not ready for the meat. So we do know that Jesus did have secret teachings, and we do know that Paul had secret teachings. And the interesting thing is that it seems that those secret teachings were the same thing. They're, as you were saying, they correspond exactly with the kinds of things that Buddha was saying that other mystics have been saying, this idea of shared divinity and shared humanity. And so it's consistent. And so I just think to me, that's very, very compelling.
Thank you for breaking that down. And I really want to get into some of the specific sayings here. But first, I have to ask you this question from your
Okay.
perspective. Why do you think that the religion of Christianity has tried so hard to suppress divergent narratives, not really narratives, but ideas about who
Yeah.
Jesus was, even when documents come to the surface that are telling a different story?
Yeah. That is a great question, because we do see that is exactly right. So on this, in my book, I talk about this, but I learned this from Dr. Elaine Pagels. And so I quote her in my book, but she wrote a book called Beyond Belief that opened my eyes to this whole thing. Early on in Christianity, sort of like around maybe 140 AD, I guess I have to correct some things too. I've always been told that basically the Christianity we have today it's like a one unbroken line all the way back to the apostles and Jesus himself. That's not quite the way it was. From the very beginning, there were Christianities, plural, all kinds of different groups of people, all of them following Jesus, who believed slightly different things, but they all would have told you that they were Christians. They all would have said, we follow Jesus, right? And the group that we sort of call the Orthodox Christians, they didn't call themselves that at the time. They're just the ones who won. They were the ones who got stronger and suppressed the other voices successfully, so that at the end of the day, they were the last one standing. Constantine he sort of deputized these guys when he shows up around 330, 340 AD, and then solidifies Christianity as we know it today. But prior to that, there was a lot of different voices, a lot of different beliefs. So there were Gnostics. That was one Christian group. There were another group that we would call, let's say, the proto-Orthodox. They'd be like Tertullian, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Origen, those guys. Those are the church fathers that we may be aware of as Christians. But then there was another group of Christians called the Valentinians. And the Valentinians followed a guy named Valentinus. What we know about Valentinus is that he was a disciple of a guy named Theodos, and Theodos was a disciple of a guy named Paul the Apostle. And we know that, by the way, not from Valentinus, but from Irenaeus and from Tertullian, all these other guys that didn't like him. They criticized him. They didn't like what he taught, but they acknowledged that he was the disciple of someone who was direct disciple of Jesus, who would have known this secret teaching that we're talking about, because you know what I mean? It's the direct disciple. And so what Dr. Pagels points out in her book is that it was really more about this sort of political kind of struggle between, let's say, Irenaeus, the followers of Irenaeus, and the followers of Valentinus. Both of them are Christian groups. Both of them believe in Jesus. But Irenaeus really didn't like Valentinus, mostly because Valentinus and his teachings and his followers were having influence over his followers. Like bishops under his control were preaching sermons quoting Valentinus and things like that. And he didn't like that. He felt, that this was a threat to him and his power, which it was. And so what we feel like happened is that it's more that Irenaeus wanted to silence and sort of marginalize Valentinus and his followers. It's more about that than it is about a specific text, let's say Thomas. It's just that Valentinus preferred Thomas. And another one, the Gospel of Truth, was another one that was a Valentinian text. So it was mostly that they just didn't like those Christians. They didn't like the way they did things. And less about the content, I think, as much about the content. Because again, half of the sayings from Thomas are in the Gospels they accept. And the other sayings are cryptic enough that, if you wanted, you could just say, come up with some other meaning for it. It doesn't make sense to reject Thomas just on its own face value. Because again, it's not contradicting things that are in the Gospels, or not contradicting things that Paul says in his epistles, like, in Corinthians or Galatians or Colossians or Ephesians. So it was mostly political. And if you would just follow the timeline from Irenaeus all the way up from 140 AD, all the way up to like 340 AD, when Constantine takes power, he gives authority, the Roman Empire gives authority to someone like Athanasius. And then Athanasius then has authority, the Roman Empire behind him, And he writes a letter. It's called the Easter letter. And he tells all these churches, Christian churches, the wording is interesting, to no longer use these texts, and he gives them a list of texts, to stop using these texts in your sermons, in your worship services, when you gather together as a church. And Thomas is one of those texts. Well, that tells us that up till that point, Thomas was used in those churches and was accepted by many churches. But Athanasius' letter, the Easter letter that goes out, that's when all of these texts on that list get destroyed and burned. And what we think happened was there was a monastery near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, where someone, instead of destroying all of those texts, bundled them all up, along with a fragment of Plato's Republic, stuck it in a giant jar, sealed it, carried it out to the desert, and buried it. And it sat there until 1945. And so we're very grateful for that, because without that, we would only have rumors that Gospel of Thomas and Gospel of Truth and some of these other texts even existed.
This leads me into another question. Are you familiar with the Gospel of the Ebionites?
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
Okay, that might be something for you
Sure.
to look into at some point and see what you think about. I'd be really curious to see what you think about it. I'm definitely no expert on it, but I've heard and I've listened to some lectures online, and I don't think we have the whole gospel. I think we only have fragments, but it seems to present a more like non-violent version of Jesus' teachings. Like, I think he says, I have no desire to eat this Passover lamb with you. And based on what I understand, Peter and James were the original leaders of Jesus' immediate followers after he left. And their group was apparently, according to this text, called the Ebionites. And there's tension between the Ebionites and then the Pauline group and some of the other Christian
That is
groups.
true, by the way. Yeah,
Okay.
that part is totally true. There was a tension between Paul and Peter and James and John. Yeah.
Right. And that's recorded in Galatians, is it?
Yes. Yeah. Paul does this thing about these so-called super apostles, and he's kind of throwing these guys under the bus, Yeah.
So anyway, I bring it up because there's a text, I'm sure you know which one it is, in the Gospel of Thomas, saying 12, where Jesus says, well, the disciples ask him, who is to be our leader after you depart from us? And Jesus says, wherever you are to go to James the righteous, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
What are your thoughts on that one?
Yes. Well, let me tell you my thoughts on that one. And this is one of the sayings, like when I was writing my commentary, writing this book on the Gospel of Thomas. So I would sit down every day and take one of the sayings, and I wouldn't read any commentaries. I wouldn't read any other books on it. I would just try to read it for myself and take the time to figure out, like, what do I think Jesus is trying to say here, right? I would do that on my own. I would write that whole chapter, and only then would I go and read what other people said. And sometimes, I was like, oh, I got it right because other people agreed. They saw the same things I saw. I'm like, okay, good. I'm on the right track. Sometimes, though, people would disagree. I would see, like, well, no, they see something totally different. I'll just tell you, it didn't change my mind. I was still convinced that, no, I think what I saw was correct. So on a couple of sayings, I disagreed with some of these people. And this is one of them. This is one of the sayings that I disagreed about, because a lot of the people that I was reading were arguing that the saying 12 couldn't possibly be a legitimate saying, that it doesn't seem to fit with everything else that Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas. And so they say, well, someone must have added this in later. And that's one theory. I reject the theory because a couple of reasons. One, I feel like Jesus is reacting to their sort of ignorance, right? He's a bit exasperated with them. And I think we see evidence of this in the Gospels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, right? He tells them over and over and over again something, and then they just don't get it, right? And then he's exasperated with them. He even says, how long will I have to bear with you guys, right? You see him getting exasperated with them and upset with them, their inability to grasp sometimes what he's trying to say. To me, that's what's happening in saying 12. Because again, we've had 11 sayings up to this point where Jesus has been telling them, that they themselves have a direct connection with the divine, that they themselves are connected to all things. That the world, in fact, he uses this all throughout the Gospel of Thomas. He uses these metaphors of the world and the earth and things like that as metaphors for the illusion, right? Because the world and the earth and things like that, this is what we see and experience around us with our senses, and it lies to us. It's telling us that everything is separate, and that's partly why we accept this lie that we are separated from God and from one another. So for Jesus to use specifically this idea of heaven and earth and the world as metaphors for the illusion, and then suddenly here in saying 12 to act like he forgot all that, right? It's not consistent. It doesn't make sense. But I think that's the clue that it is an actual saying from Jesus. And he's hoping that by kind of being facetious here and in his response to the disciples, that they're going to get it. They're going to be, oh, wait a minute, that was a weird response. That doesn't sound like what he's been saying, everything else he's been saying. So here's my take on it, right? The disciples asked Jesus, we know that you will leave us, and who will be our leader? The problem with that is that all through Thomas, there's even a place, one of my favorite sayings, where Thomas calls him master, and Jesus says, I am not your master.
Yeah,
So
I just read that one.
Yeah, I love it. The teachings, and Jesus is trying to teach them, like, you don't need a guru, you don't need a leader, you don't need a master, right? There's a saying I love where it's one we're familiar with, where he says, the blind lead the blind, and they both fall into a ditch. When you read it in Thomas, separated from the narratives that when that same saying is used in the other gospels, separated from those narratives, and you just read it at face value in the context of, again, the lens we're reading through, suddenly that saying spoke out to me, and I was like, oh, if the blind lead the blind and they both fall into a ditch, Jesus is saying, don't be blind, right? Open your eyes, because once you can see for yourself, you don't need anybody to lead you. In other words, only blind people need someone to guide them around. So again, he's challenging this notion that what the disciples need is a leader who's just going to answer all their questions and lead them around by the hand. But that's their question. They ask, we know that you're going to leave us. Now again, how can he leave them if everything's connected, right? Their question is betraying the fact that they've forgotten it or they're not getting it. And who will be our leader? And then Jesus answers them. And again, I think he's rolling his eyes the whole time he's saying this. Wherever you are, go to James the righteous, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being. Again, what is heaven and earth is a metaphor for what? The lie of separation. So it's like, okay, if you think you need a leader and you think I'm going to actually leave you and you could be separate from me at some point, then yeah, you just go back to this Jewish teacher of the law, James, and he'll lead you in that illusion. That illusion of separation. In other words, like, yeah, I guess if that's what you think reality is, then I guess that's what you should do. You should just go ahead and do that. And so I think he's just being a little sarcastic and a little ironic, but I do think it's a legitimate saying. I don't reject it. I see Jesus as trying to teach his disciples the exact same thing, but from just a different response, a different way.
That makes so much sense. And I have that other saying that you referenced written down here. I forgot to note which saying it was, but he asked his disciples to tell him what he is like or whom he is like.
Yeah.
And Simon Peter says, you are like a righteous angel. Matthew says, you are like a wise philosopher. Thomas says, my mouth is wholly incapable of saying whom you are like. And then Jesus says, I am not your master. Because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring which I have measured out.
Mm-hmm.
And he took him and withdrew and told him 3 things. When Thomas returned to his companions, they asked him, what did Jesus say to you? Thomas said to them, if I tell you one of the things which he told me, you will pick up stones and throw them at me. A fire will come out of the stones and burn you up. So firstly, very interesting passage.
Yeah.
But he's touching on what we've been talking about, where for 2,000 years now, people have been doing exactly this, becoming drunk on his sayings and completely misinterpreting them and making him the Lord and
Yes.
master, when actually, what is he actually trying to teach us? And I'm curious if you have any idea what those 3 things were that he said to Thomas.
Yeah. What's interesting is, I wish I knew the number either. I was just looking to see what the exact ones. I didn't mark that one for some reason in my copy here. But what we think is that, well, it's one or the other. Oh, there it is. It's saying 13. I found it. So in saying 13, we don't know. He doesn't say what it is, right? He just said, Thomas says, he told me these three things, and if I tell you even one of them, you pick up stones and throw them at me. So what we think possibly the answer is either we don't know, or the answer is the very next saying. Because in saying 14, it says this, Jesus said to them, if you fast, you will bring forth sin for yourselves. And if you pray, you will be condemned. And if you give alms, you will do harm to your spirits. And so those are three things. And so the idea is that possibly those three things, he says it in the next saying, basically don't pray, don't give alms, and don't fast. Which to a Jewish person, yes, that would have been blasphemous because that's directly in contradiction to what the Old Testament law says, right? That you are supposed to do all these things. But Jesus' point in that saying is that if you are doing those things because you think by giving alms or fasting or praying, you're going to get God's attention, you're going to, sort of convince God to do what you want, that's a waste of time. You're doing the wrong thing. That's not how it works. In other words, that's not how God operates. You are already connected to the divine. You don't need to get God's attention. You don't need to get God's, to attract God in some way. Like you and God are forever connected in ways you can't even imagine. And so fasting and praying and giving alms isn't going to make you more connected to God. So that's one theory, is that it's in the very next saying. So
Interesting. Okay, so I'm going to share with you the saying that actually turned me off the first time I read Gospel of Thomas,
okay.
probably 8 years ago now, and see what
Yeah.
your take is on this one. And I
Okay.
think this is probably problematic to a lot of women.
Oh, I think I know what you're going to say. Yeah,
Yep.
I know which one you're going to say here. Yeah, go ahead.
Saying 114, where Peter says, "Let
Yes.
Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." And Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven."
Yes. Oh, yeah. And that is probably the most controversial saying in the Gospel of Thomas. It's the very last one. And this is another one of those sayings where a lot of scholars of Thomas will say that can't be original, because again, it does go against other things Jesus says in Thomas. It doesn't seem to fit something Jesus would say. I put 114 in that same kind of category as the last one we just talked about, where at face value, it doesn't seem to be something Jesus would say. However, I think in the context of everything else that Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, he is trying to get his disciples to remember what he has told them, to remember the other 113 sayings he's given them about this shared divinity and the shared oneness. So I think it's legitimate, but I think Jesus is wanting his disciples and wanting us as readers to rather than just react to that at face value, to reflect back on again some of the other sayings. And I think specifically saying 22. So let me read what Jesus says in saying 22, because I think this helps us understand what's actually happening in 114. So in saying 22, Jesus sees some infants who are being suckled, and he said to his disciples, "These infants being suckled are like those who enter the kingdom." And they said to him, "Shall we then become infants to enter the kingdom?" And Jesus says to them, "When you make the two one, and when you make the inside as the outside, and the outside as the inside, and the upper as the lower, when you make the male and the female into a single one, so that the male is not male and the female is not female, and when you make eyes in place of an eye, and a hand in place of a hand, and a foot in place of a foot, and an image in place of an image, then you shall enter the kingdom." So I think if we hold in our minds what he just said in saying 22, to me, and by the way, I think saying 22 is one of the most powerful statements in all of the Gospel of Thomas about this illusion of separation, right? He says it exactly. There is no inside and outside. You have to make the inside like the outside and the outside like the inside. You have to make the upper like the lower, right? Those things that seem to be about separateness are illusions, and we have to erase them. To enter the kingdom, we have to see that those things, that isn't reality, right? There is a oneness. But then he, of course, says the specific part about to make the male and the female into a single one. So the male is not male and the female is not female. If we keep that in our minds when we read 114, again, it's just Peter being stupid and, again, making this very misogynist, statement. Women aren't worthy of all this stuff, and Mary should get out of here and stuff. And it's like Jesus saying, oh, yeah, okay, Peter, don't worry. Listen, I'll make her into a male so that she can enter the kingdom. But I think it's on purpose meant to echo back to saying 22. And Peter, guess what that means? I'm going to make you into a female, right? Because we have to make the two one, right? And to the point where those distinctions don't make any difference, or that goes away. This is also in line with, and again, one of the things I think is really speaks to the reality that this idea, these sayings of Jesus and Thomas, are indeed the sort of secret teachings that Jesus, that also was passed on to Paul. And one of the first epistles that Paul ever writes, it's the book to the Galatians, the letter to the Galatians. And if you think about it, the Gospels weren't even written yet, right? So they were aware of the sayings of Jesus. None of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, none of them had written down yet. There's just Christians in different places following Jesus. And Paul writes a letter to this church in Galatia. They get this letter, they open it up, and they read Paul saying something that up to that point, no one has ever suggested to them. Because in Galatians, Paul says almost exactly the same thing in saying 22. And we wonder where he got it from. Maybe he got it from Jesus, right? Because it's one of the sayings of Jesus and Thomas. But Paul says in Galatians that in Christ there is no Jew or Gentile, slave or free, rich or poor, male or female. Why? Because we are all one in Christ. That was a mind-blowing statement, but it's right in line with Jesus saying 22 in the Gospel of Thomas. And I think if we keep that in mind as a main teaching of Jesus, then saying 114 is another example of Jesus kind of being facetious with his disciples who are still not getting it. Even at the very last saying, they still don't get it. And he's like, oh, yeah, okay, sure. Because we know he doesn't believe this. Jesus doesn't think women are lesser and can't, aren't worthy of anything. But he wants Peter to get it. He wants Peter to wake up and realize what he just said and how that's in clear opposition to all the other things that Jesus has been trying to teach them to that point.
I love that so much. So I would like to ask you what your favorite saying is.
There's too many. Let me see. Okay, well, here's one of them. I mean, all the ones we've talked about so far kind of are my favorite ones. I do love 22. I do love the one about, I'm not your master, the lion and the man, all that. I love all that. But this one's really great. I'll just say, saying number 4, Jesus said, the man old in days will not hesitate to ask a small child, 7 days old, about the place of life, and he will live. For many who are first will become last, and they will become one and the same. It's just so beautiful. Because it's talking about like true wisdom isn't something that we have to acquire as we get older, wisdom that we have to learn and study. Again, it's not about information. So this old person who should be someone you would think has all this great wisdom. Jesus says, no, that person could turn to an infant, 7 days old, and find truth and find wisdom. Because it's about simply being and simply resting like a child, right? All you can do is breathe and eat and sleep and rest. And that's just beautiful. I just love the simple wisdom in that. And I love also that he ends it by saying, not just that the first will become the last, but they will, again, what's the ultimate goal? That they will become one and the same. So I love that saying.
That's one of the ones that stood out to me too. And I don't know what your beliefs are about this, and I could be filtering it through my own lens. But
Sure.
when I read that, it makes me wonder if he's talking about pre-birth memories, like maybe the young child remembers where it just came from.
Yeah. No, I think that's possible. Because I think that idea, at least the idea of an original innocence that we have when we're first born and when we're children, sort of there's a point at which in our development as human beings, we begin to believe the lie. We begin to accept the illusion, mostly because like mimetic theory is something Rene Girard talks about. This is how human beings are. Human beings are mimetic creatures, meaning we mimic one another. It's the way a baby learns to speak whatever language it's born into. It's how a baby learns to, what's good and what's bad, all kinds of unspoken sort of cultural cues and clues that are never taught directly to the child, but the child just picks up on these things and just assimilates into the culture. That's mimetic. We observe and we copy. And that mimetic nature of humanity is why young children just automatically accept this lie of separation, because their parents seem to behave this way and everyone around them behaves this way. But it's going against sort of an inner truth and wisdom that we all have as children and as infants, that accepts the oneness, right? And we have to kind of get back to that. We have to go back to this place where we're able to see beyond the illusion and go back to something that we knew at the very beginning. But we knew it in a way we couldn't express in words.
Could you share with us maybe one of the things that was the most difficult for you to wrap your mind around?
Oh my gosh. I wish, let me see. I just remember there were a couple of them where when I first started to look at them, I didn't get it. And I was thinking, maybe this doesn't fit the paradigm. Maybe it doesn't fit that lens. But then I would have sort of like an aha moment and be like, oh, now I see it. I wish I could remember which ones those were. But I do know that happened to me a couple of times. And those were usually the ones also that when I would go back afterwards and try to look up and see what other scholars thought about those things, that I had seen something they hadn't seen. And so that was also especially exciting. But it would take me a while to dig through it and find them, but I probably should do that. Because that did happen. I just can't think of any specific ones right now, like which ones those were.
Yeah, yeah, no problem. I have one more that I'll ask you about. This is a really interesting one because it's, I think, 3 times in the Gospels.
Yeah.
And I have gotten so many questions about this. I'm sure you too, as a former pastor, have gotten questions. And it's really interesting that it's included in the Gospel of Thomas. It's the one who says, or it's saying 44, where
Mhm.
Jesus says, whoever blasphemes against the Father will be forgiven, and whoever blasphemes against the Son will be forgiven, but whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven either on earth or in heaven. Now, I'm noticing that earth and heaven is there, and I'm
Yes.
remembering what you said about duality previously, but that text is one that really, really trips people up.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this idea of sort of an unforgivable sin, right? That's definitely something I heard a lot about, and I've had people come and write to me and want to know the answers to that. So I think in Thomas, that is a difficult one. I think, again, we have to keep in mind what Jesus is saying all throughout Thomas, right? So the idea that, blasphemy against God or blasphemy against Jesus would be forgiven. So, it's sort of because when we're speaking against God or we're speaking against Jesus, we're speaking against ourselves. There's no division, right? So if we recognize there's no division, God is not up there, out there somewhere. God is within us. So this sort of blasphemy is sort of like, well, we're just talking to ourselves. We're not really talking about a being above us and outside of us or anything like that. But when love speaks against love, or when Christ speaks against Christ, love and forgiveness are eternally present, right, in that moment. So when we speak against ourselves, whether that's against God or Christ or against even humanity, it's coming out of a place of foolishness and ignorance. We don't really know what we're saying. And we would only speak that way because we don't see sort of the reality of oneness with God and the oneness with others. So it's forgiven because it's coming out of a place of ignorance. We don't know what we're talking about. So again, but the other part of it is this idea of blasphemy against the Spirit will not be forgiven either in heaven or on earth. So again, as you said, heaven and earth is the illusion, right? So we don't need to worry about that. But it's sort of like this lack of forgiveness is again just sort of a temporary state of being that lasts as long as our blindness lasts. And they're just not a. It's not a. You're not forgiven, but it's like, well, you're not forgiven as long as you remain in that state of mind. That once the blindness is gone, once you realize what you're doing, what you're saying, then forgiveness does come along with the enlightenment that you receive. So again, I think the clue is also in that phrase heaven and earth, because that's again a phrase that's pointing us to this ideal of the illusion and blindness and all that kind of thing. So I hope that makes sense. It is a difficult one, but I think again the clue is in him equating it to the heaven and earth thing. That heaven and earth is this temporary illusion, and when that fades away, reality breaks in, and then once our ignorance is gone, then we can finally experience that forgiveness.
Thank you for explaining. I think I threw all the difficult passages at you. this interview.
Yeah, you did.
So thank you for answering my questions and being willing to have this conversation. I would like to give you a chance to share with the viewers more about your book and where they can find you. Anything else you're involved in?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Melissa. This was great. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about Thomas and about my book. The final thought I would have, I want to leave with people, I guess, is that as I was going through Thomas and I see Jesus emphasizing this powerful and beautiful truth about our shared divinity and our shared humanity, what I realize is that I keep saying this is, to me, this is the answer to everything. If we can get this, if humanity can get this, if we can recognize that we are not separate from God, if we can recognize that we are connected to one another in ways we can't even imagine, this is the way we can finally, truly love our neighbor as ourselves. Because when I see my neighbor, I don't see another, I see myself. This is how we can end war, right? And genocide. Because how can I go and kill another person when I see that person, if I can see the divinity in that person, if I can see myself in that person, then I can never kill them, right? This is the end to poverty and hunger. Because if I see someone in need and hungry, I don't just see another person. I see God. I see myself. I recognize that shared divinity and that shared humanity. And I think it is so powerful and so necessary because I think everybody feels this today. I feel like everywhere we turn, social media, especially in the news, all of the voices, all of the messages we're receiving are constantly telling us that we're separate, that we're divided, that those people are the problem and those people are dangerous and these people are going to ruin everything. And it's this constant, we're overwhelmed with this us and them message. And it divides us, and I think it's killing us, right? On the inside, spiritually, it's death. And so I think we need this message more than ever. We need a voice like Jesus and Thomas reminding us that that's an illusion, that the reality is we are all, every single one of us, we are connected to the divine, and we are brothers and sisters. We are one family. We are all connected to one another. And that's a truth that's not only reflected in Thomas, it's reflected in the other gospels, it's reflected in other mystics, it's reflected in quantum science. That's why I called it the quantum sayings of Jesus. Quantum science is telling us that it's an illusion to perceive reality as everything is a separate object and a separate thing. The quantum science says everything is one thing. It's the quantum field. The quantum field is everything, and everything is an expression of the same quantum field. So even though we may think we're separate from one another, everything is actually one thing. We're all connected in incredible ways. And I think this message of oneness and connection is so important, probably now more than ever. So that's why I'm so excited about this book. I'm excited for people to read the book and hopefully have that same realization, because the more of us who get this and the more of us who begin living this out, this changes everything. It changes us and it changes the world around us. So, the world will not change until we change. And so I think it's very important for us to participate in that transformation process. So that's why I'm excited about this book. And yeah, I'm on, you want to follow me, keithgiles.com is my blog. I do a couple of podcasts. Heretic Happy Hour, Second Cup with Keith is my solo podcast. And my books are on Amazon. This book is on Amazon on Kindle and paperback.
Wonderful. I will have all the links in the show notes. Keith has a whole other series he's written, the Jesus series, and then Sola Mysterium and Sola Deus.
Sola Deus. Yeah.
Deus, yep. And now the Quantum Sayings of Jesus. So check them out. Keith, thank you so much for having this conversation.
Melissa, it's been awesome. Thank you so much for letting me come back and talk about this.
Thank you for watching and listening. Your views, likes, comments, and shares truly make the biggest difference in supporting this channel. Don't forget to check the show notes for all the links to today's guest, as well as my links. You'll find me on social media at Love Covered Life, my website, lovecoveredlife.com, and the Be a Guest link for anybody who would like to be a guest on the channel. I have great news. Love Covered Life podcast is coming available on audio podcast. You can find it wherever you listen to your audio podcasts.